Well, hello everybody. It's now 7 o'clock on Tuesday. My name is Peter Wainwright, and I'm your facilitator for this 1-hour strategy webinar. So you'll see we have on the slide here 3 panelists. We're waiting for Antoine to join us. We've got some logging in problems. So we're joined this evening by Professor Tom Lawton, who is Professor of Strategy and International Management at the Open University Business School. Jo Salter, an independent business consultant and coach. She was the facilitator for the 7th of January event, which this webinar follows from. And Antoine Boatwright, who is Global Services Marketing Operations Director for Dell. I'm just going to move you on to the next slide, which has got our objectives. The objectives are to share some of the learning from that event we had on the 7th of February in Manchester, and for you to gain some insights from the videos and the discussion about how to make your strategy in your context more effective. So this is the slide of the Strategy Masterclass. I'm going to ask Jo just to say a couple of words. She was the facilitator for this event, just to give us some context for where we are today. So, Jo, would you like to just offer some comments on this, please?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Peter. And hello and good evening to all of you. Excellent to see so many people taking part of it. So the day that we had was the second event in our business perspective, run by Professor Tom Lawton, who of course is here this evening, and in Manchester. And I think what's so wonderful about the event that we're having today is that it's enabling the content to be shared, to get a taster of the day and the session that we had. And it was fascinating to see that the common themes that came out during the day. You can see on the screen ahead of you, which shows the agenda for the 7th of February, all of the different experts that we had sharing different sector information, sharing different experiences. What was the most interesting was how common themes came through about internationalization, if one can ever say that, and innovation, and about really just not letting things go. And hopefully you're going to get a taste of that with the videos that you're going to see today. One of the other things that was amazing, I thought, Peter, was the different sectors and the people and the different positions that everybody was in, but still interested in strategy, the difference that it made, and taking away tools and techniques for the real world. And we're hoping tonight that you will be able to get some of those tools and techniques to take away for you to be able to use in your workplaces as well. That's about all I had to say for now. Thank you, Peter.
Independent practice as a consultant in strategy and innovation, I found it personally very useful. So there's lots of learning from me. Okay, so we'll move on to the agenda for the webinar. So we'll soon be moving into a series of 3 videos, and the format is that we have a short video, usually between sort of 7 and 9 minutes. Then after the video, we've got a poll that we will launch and have some discussion. Video 3 is in part 1 and 2 shorter parts, and then we'll have 2 polls at the end. Then we'll invite some summary comments from our panelists and close. And the way that you attendees can participate is somewhat strange in webinars, in that we can't hear from you, but we do have the chat facility. So I would invite you, as you're viewing the videos, to chat away. Some of you might know each other. Maybe reflect on what you're learning. What does it mean for your organization? And if you have particular questions, do pose them in there, because we will use that as our pool to pick off some questions for the panel to reflect back on. So, and then you can reflect back in the chat. I personally won't be joining in the chat because there's enough to do facilitating the flow. And well, let's see how it goes. So welcome to you. We've now got 150 participants, which is a fantastic number. So what I'm going to do now is hand over control to Janet and ask her to move ahead to the first video, please.
So, strategy. How many of you here are strategists? How many of you here are skeptical or cynical about strategy? Okay, we've got two honest people. That's fine. My objective is to convert you. So what I want to give you this morning, based on my own research and my own work, is the idea that perhaps in terms of positioning for growth, this idea of moving forward, being proactive, looking for new opportunity, that there are 3 I's for growth. The 3 I's are innovate, particularly innovate. I'll talk about innovation in a second, but innovate here, not just from the point of view of product development, but from the point of view of your customer and the promise you make to your customer. So what a value proposition is, in a sense, right? It's the promise you make to your customer. How do you innovate that? Secondly, internationalize, but internationalize cleverly. Don't just go after the obvious targets. Oh, everybody's gone to China, let's go to China. Thirdly, integrate your market and non-market. I'll get back to that in a few minutes, which is current work I'm doing around really trying to turn activities in the non-market environment, meaning social, political, regulatory, cultural challenges, into opportunities, perhaps, and not just something you're forced to deal with, but something that actually you can differentiate, perhaps. So, in a kind of game show host kind of sense, we're going to have 3 doors that you can choose between. Maybe even go through all 3, who knows, depending on how adventurous you are. So behind door number 1 is innovate your value proposition.
We encourage everybody who we work with, or everybody and then everybody, to use our data, use our brand, use our content, and it just gets the name everywhere. This is a guide. All our partners who are travel partners send out emails on our behalf. So if you have stayed in the Ramada, that you will get Kevin got a how was your stay, courtesy of TripAdvisor, and they're just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So the reason that they do this, and Wyndham is an interesting case in point, is that businesses are beginning to understand they need to embrace user-generated content. These people are claiming that they increase their conversion rate by 30%, which is vast, really significant if you're in the hotel business. We embrace competition. It is crucially important in this kind of world to get comfortable with your frenemies, because we don't have, on the 5 forces type of view of the world, we have people who are suppliers and who are also potential competitors, or are competitors who are also our customers. And so it's all a bit of a, needing to be, you need to love everybody somehow.
I've done a lot of work on airlines and with airlines over the last 15 or 16 years. But when you think about Ryanair, this was not something new. This was what he was doing. He was adopting and adapting a business model and a strategy from elsewhere. Now, that elsewhere can be either another industry or another geographical jurisdiction. In this case, it was another country, of course, bringing the Southwest model into Europe and adapting it for the European context and the Ryanair cultural context, organizational culture, both. And O'Leary was ahead of the pack. I know Stelios and EasyJet sometimes claim to be the first, but they weren't, of course. Ryanair was a failing company before O'Leary came in. Set up in the mid-1980s as a regional airline, flying between Waterford in Ireland and Luton. And it was a disaster, really. It was not a good company. O'Leary came in, age of 29, deputy CEO, and brought in a whole new way of thinking. He recognized in 1992 that the world was changing and that industry was shifting in Europe. Deregulation was happening. European air transport deregulation took 10 years to happen. O'Leary recognized that by 1997, January 1st, 1997, the market would be completely deregulated. So he began to reconfigure the company to be ready for that. For many SMEs in particular, You internationalize as part of a network, typically. I've done some research on this, for example, in Taiwan some years ago with a colleague of mine from Taipei, where we looked at 2,500 Taiwanese SMEs and their internationalization process. And the vast majority of them internationalized as part of a network, meaning, I'm sure some of you recognize this, a large client wanted them to go with them, so they went with them. Downside of that is that if you get pulled into international markets, there may come a time, and I've seen this with a client I worked with 2 years ago, where you have to stop and reflect and say, are we where we should be? Are we just where we were pulled into? Does it make sense? Is there any sort of logic to our global footprint? How do I adapt my company's leadership? Here's the big challenge, particularly for SMEs. How do I adapt my company's leadership, governance, structure, and culture to succeed? So the world as we know it, the obvious challenges, as I mentioned already, the obvious targets, rather, are the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, in and of themselves massively different.
I look after a business that has about 10,000 seats across the UK that are essentially a contact centres. They do a mixture of answering phones, dealing with multi-channel digital media as well. But my concern is, and this is a concern looking forward 2 or 3 years, there is a risk that my business becomes redundant. Because you all go onto Twitter, or you all go onto the web, and I need to adapt the business to think about how do I make money in that environment. So historically, the value of contact centres have been around scale, this idea that if you have a huge number of seats, you've got a big revenue stream over which you can defray a fixed cost. So if you get bigger, and we are the largest player in the UK, we can price more cheaply. That's true for now, but I don't believe it going forwards. The real asset is not the scale, it's the fact that we listen to 150 million end customer interactions every year. So we know more about you, we should know more about you than probably many of the people that we sell to. That's our asset. So what do I need to do is I need to start repositioning the business into a business that's about customer analytics, not just about customer contact.
Okay, so we saw some snippets there on the video from Professor Tom Lawton, Alison Kopus, and Mike Barnard, looking at in the context of the 3 I's framework. Before we run to the poll, could I just ask Tom Lawton to offer a couple of reflections on this, please, on the 3 I's framework? Hello, Tom. No, I don't think he's there. I'm not sure Tom can hear us. Okay, not to worry. We'll get him in. Hello? Hello, Thomas? There's a problem there. Not to worry. What we'll do is, in the context of that video, I'm going to launch a poll here, which I'll put on the screen. You can now see it, and we've got a minute to, or 30 seconds to respond. So we'll launch it now. Which of the following doors that Tom mentioned has the most appeal for your organization's strategy right now? So you have to choose between those 3. Innovating the value proposition, different ways maybe of internationalizing and integrating for example, customer analytics and listening to customer habits. So integrating what's happening externally with the changes you might be making internally in response. So let's launch that poll now, please, Janet, and see what answers we get. And we'll then use that to cue some discussion. So the poll is now live.
Hello, Peter? Hello?
Hello?
Peter, can you hear me?
Hello, Tom. Yes, I can hear you.
I apologize. I somehow got disconnected.
Don't worry. It's technology. So well, let's see what that poll reveals in a second. The poll has ended. We should be having the results soon. There we go. Oh, so the vast majority of people felt innovating the value proposition, small number internationalizing, and a third integrating. Tom, could I invite some comment from you then on what's your reflections on the poll results?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. My apologies for getting cut off somehow earlier. And thank you all very much for joining us this evening. My thoughts are, well, how can I go against the poll, right, particularly of our own alumni, etc. I think the innovating the value proposition clearly is essential because internationalizing is not for everybody, and certainly depending on your size and your age, etc., it may not be something that you're looking at right now, but definitely your customer value proposition, let's face it, is integral to strategy. If you don't have the customer-facing approach right, then nothing else matters. So I completely agree that in terms of prioritization, it makes sense to put that number one.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And before we look at the chat, Joe, do you have any thoughts on this from your experience and your work? What do you see in terms of people's beginning to really innovate in the value proposition?
I think there was an excellent example that was given by Mike Barnard on the event in Manchester, where he was discussing Polaroid and saying that Polaroid had the most amazing and innovative idea, which of course as technology changed as well, and they had a different choice to make and a different decision to make at the stage that digital cameras came in and the way people use cameras changed. And I think it's been very interesting over the last 20 or 30 years really, watching the technological change, and who knows where we're going to be in the next 20 years.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Some very good points. I mean, don't we wish that we could all perhaps innovate as much as TripAdvisor, whose sort of business model is revolutionary, and their growth is just sort of meteoric. Makes you wonder what's going to be happening with them in a couple of years' time. Now, on the chat, I don't know if my fellow panelists can see anything, but I'm looking to see if we've got some questions or comments from you. I think as attendees, you can only see, you can't see the whole list of attendees. So we've got a few comments there about trying to log on and off. But does anybody have any responses to the panel results or anything they find unusual? Has anybody got any questions for the panel? I don't know if Janet, Joe, or others can you? Am I missing any
questions
here?
There yet, Peter? I keep looking. And
yep. Okay. No worries. We're warming people up. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, don't forget you can send comments by chat or questions anytime. Let's move on to the second video, where hopefully we'll get at some further perspectives, and you'll see the list of presenters and the topics coming up on the screen. So I'll now hand over to Janet to launch our second video, please.
The first thing I want to say is that the notion of global isn't a static notion of global, right? It's changed over the last 20 years. When I started in a global role, the first thing was flying was cheaper. And I saw this just a couple of weeks ago and just realized that it was at least 6 or 7 times more expensive than the last time I'd taken a low-cost airline. It's also very much, I think, for very high executives. Now global is very much something for everybody. You can be a global employee at any level today, right? In the olden days, that's not how it was. I said broadband was rare, non-existent. You had to get an ISDN line. Even then, the kind of rates that you got were very slow. Didn't really permit you to work from home. And teleworking was really just an academic notion. And when I talk about distance protected is in this global world back 20 years ago, you could be an isolated market. You could be the French market. You could be the UK market. And it was all of that was protected by the fact that it wasn't really truly global. We knew about each other. There was more information about each of the various things. Barriers to entry in the markets were coming down. But still, you could be very much. And whenever you would go into that country, and you'd say, look, we've got a program we want to go and execute or do something, and say, oh, doesn't work in the French market, or doesn't work in the German market. So it's very different. And today, that's not so much the case, much, much less. And a lot of the globalization was very Western-driven, US-centric, European-centric. Now, you can see that the emerging powers are not there, and the balance has changed. When I first joined Dell, which was a very actually innovative company back in those days, we had a USP. We were very good at it. And we were expanding at a rate of knots. And that expansion was really done by metrics. So we did change by metric. We gave each of the individual countries a couple of metrics, a revenue metric, a margin metric, maybe one or two other metrics. So the countries and regions were quite free, and the employees could do whatever they wanted to a great extent, as long as they were achieving those metrics. Right? So there's a lot of advantages to that. What you also saw is that there were a lot of rash course corrections, because if you're managing to that metric and you miss that metric, even by a couple of weeks, you're constantly overreacting, bring that metric back on. Now, in the last 3 years, we've kind of changed the way that we're looking at it, and we're doing change by strategic objective alignment. What I mean by that now is that we've got about 4 or 5 key objectives that we want to achieve. No longer do the geographies have the ability to go and implement it the way they want, right? They have to go and implement this. We're slightly freer in as much as we're no longer driven by short-term metrics. We can miss a quarter, we can miss 2 quarters, as long as we go and achieve that objective. It leads to slightly better behavior and longer-term thinking, but then the short-term results sometimes get misinterpreted. So, and you probably, the reality is real life is probably somewhere in between those 2 extremes, right? When you take a look at how that change is occurring.
I used to be a management consultant for the Boston Consulting Group, and I had an interaction with one of my clients, who will remain nameless, in the record industry, and I was doing some work with the Boston Consulting Group team, trying to help, sponsored by the holding group of the record labels, one of the most successful record labels or record industry businesses in the UK, to help them get better at signing artists that sell 1 million+ records. So there is a real opportunity to use smart business techniques to help an industry that historically has been about lawyers being successful because they sign deals, and A&R people, artists and repertoire people who spot stars. What we did, we took a pharmaceutical research and development pipeline tool and applied it to the record industry. So just in the way that pharmaceutical firms work out how many early stage drugs do I need to start developing to try and get to a product that's going to be $1 billion sales opportunity, we used exactly the same techniques that we deployed in pharmaceutical firms for the record industry. So how many people do you need to see in the urban sector to sign to create the stars? Right? Pretty simple, quite a lot of complex analysis that was done, and then we took it to this particular record label. But what I think is interesting is that historically, those businesses don't understand a key element of what they're trying to do. So strategy is basically about delivering sustainable competitive advantage.
Remember, you got all these filters, language, you got culture, you got distance, etc. You have to be the person who creates a kind of super identity, something that sits on top that people can all, right, associate with. In a global situation with global teams, everything will always come to a compromise. There will be a compromise. And the compromise may be in the way you do it, not in what you do. But just as the leader has to have a global mindset, so does the team member, right? I have what I call orphans, people in countries that are by themselves, they have no local management, and I'm their local manager here. So back to my point, which I hopefully have made, it's all about communication. So here's some kind of little tips. The first is around etiquette. So I'll give you a specific example. Please and thank you. Right? In England, a lot of people say please and thank you. Before you've actually done something, you say sorry. Yeah? The second is, in your one-to-ones with your directs in different countries, 50% has to be about the person. Forget about work for the first 50% of that meeting. Understand the individual, right? You need to understand their motivators. They're further away. You need to know what their levers are, right? You need to take a genuine interest. You need to make sure that they don't think that when your back's turned, you've forgotten about them. And I think as a leader, the more you do that, and back to what I'm about, the more I travel the world, the more I realize that we all have the same concerns. Back to it, speak, check understanding, and be very patient. And if you build the time and you know that you have to be patient, you know that you have to drive, build time to create the change, to create the momentum for change, you'll be successful.
So the scope, who the client was, they were a UK-based department of a large American credit card company. We're using tools for a small department of a very large organization. So the strategy is for everybody. The tools we're talking about, they're not just for the boardroom, they're for the whole organization. So the first one that we touched on, simple interviews. So we sat down, we talked to all the people involved, not just the execs who had the issue and who were getting worried about their sales figures. We talked to the sales guys. We talked to the marketing people. We talked to the solution implementation people. We talked to the guys who were involved in account management. So once we did get involved, and we did sign the client and the implementation guys, we actually found out that we had the wrong points of contact. We also looked here at the numbers, as all do consultants do. Let's see what the numbers tell us. So I was able to look at the spend profile that was going through the customers just to see how much money and how much revenue are we losing by not being able to have a strategy, by not being able to implement properly. The big weakness that we touched on was the brand of the company itself. The minute we said, we are from company X, it was a mental picture. So it was very difficult to sell something that was different. The value proposition, the client didn't have anything like a proper value proposition to sell to the procurement guys or to sell to accounts payable. They had what they thought was too generic a value proposition. It wasn't customer-centric to the right customers. It was a generic value proposition identified by people who didn't understand who their clients were. So everything that came out of that was new to our client.
Okay, folks, so that's our second video clip, and we're going to have a poll for that in a second. But before we move on to the poll, we've had a lot of questions coming through. Joe's been making some notes, and a lot of the questions obviously relate to the first video. So, Joe, could I ask you to maybe, is there a question that you particularly would like to respond to from the various ones that are coming through? And then I'll ask Tom to follow up.
I think I just first of all want to say that that I understand. Thank you, John. That you only have an all panelists, so you can only send the questions to us. I'm just going to relay them so that you can read them and see a copy of them, which I'm just starting to do now. I think what I'd like to do really is Antoine will have to type because I see he doesn't have any audio. But one of the questions was having an example of sharing of what strategic objective alignment means. And I suppose in my view, my personal view, bearing in mind I have an ex-military as well as public and private sector, is that, that to me that the strategy that is being set within an organisation has to be in keeping with and aligned with the objectives, the day-to-day tactics that are being carried out within the organisation. There should be this marrying of strategy and tactical operational work so that the innovative, I'm going to try again, internationalise, I can't do that word, organisations can move forward. But Tom, you are bound to have something to say on that, so I shall pass to you.
Yeah, I think the idea of alignment has got at least three definitions or three understandings, Joe. One is what you've highlighted, which is the alignment between, let's call it the alignment between the company's strategy or the business strategy and the business policy, to use an old-fashioned word, which really refers to the tactics, as you said, but also the rules, the procedures, the way of working within the organization. So that's the first stage of alignment, or type of alignment. The second type of alignment is the alignment between what we can call the market and the non-market strategy, meaning the alignment between your market positions, your business objectives on the one hand, And on the other hand, what you do in the political, social, cultural space that you occupy, meaning, for example, regulatory issues, government relations, social obligations or interactions you have with external partners in terms of communities, non-governmental organizations, etc. So aligning what you do as a company, as a business, as a profit-making organization with your position and your role, and you may argue responsibilities within wider society and the state. And then the third type of alignment is the alignment between you as a company and your supply chain or value chain partners. And we only have to look at some of the problems, for example, that Apple has had with Foxconn in China, or that BP had in the Gulf of Mexico disaster with its partners, supply chain partners such as Halliburton, to recognize that if what you say and do is not aligned with what your partners say and do, then the whole thing can come a cropper and create a lot of lost shareholder value potentially.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. There's an awful lot more we could probably say about that. I'm keen to move on to poll number 2, and let's look at the questions there. And I'm sure that will probably follow nicely from what we had on the first video. So looking at the second video with Antoine's point, especially about thinking of all our people as global and not just having that label with the top management team. That's A. Do you think that's important for your practice, the most important? Or B, to actually spend more time thinking about who delivers the message, about implementation? And I noticed in the questions there's a lot about culture and values and that sort of implementation. And I think it's probably very challenging, particularly in the public sector. And C, looking at the last clip there from Michael Canning about, actually going back to some very simple strategy frameworks to actually improve the quality of your strategy. So which of these is most important for you, for your own practice right now? So the poll's now running. Okay, time's up, and let's see what results we get. Hopefully that will come up in a second. We have the technology. Well, while waiting for the results, let's here we go. Right. So A gets a relatively small amount about thinking of our people as global. Maybe some of you are already there. B seems to get 30%, running closely behind C, which is quite interesting actually, because I would have thought sometimes people would spend more time on B, and these strategy frameworks some people regard with sort of skepticism. So I'm glad to see there's a healthy response there, and 26% no answer. What I'd like to do is, Tom, could you offer a comment on this, and maybe Antoine can in the chat as well. Looking at particularly at the sort of the public sector, what's your thoughts about how we actually deliver the strategy implementation message? What was your reflections on Antoine's talk, and particularly in the public sector? So do you have any comments on item B there?
Well, I think Antoine is spot on that the key to effective strategy delivery or implementation is communication. And communication is easily said and done. And of course, if you're talking about a small company, entrepreneurial startup, etc., then communication is relatively straightforward because you're only communicating to a limited number of people with typically very similar values, perhaps, and approaches to you. When it goes to the public sector or when it goes to an international context, then communication becomes a lot more complex. Antoine, in his talk, because of the nature of his position and responsibilities, was clearly speaking much more about the international cross-cultural challenges of communicating to deliver strategy. If we're talking about the public sector, then you have the challenges of different stakeholders and different objectives from that as well, in terms of the lack of a pure profit motive, perhaps, but the need for cost efficiencies and the need for societal value and beyond that as well, and in a sense also responding to governmental and regulatory needs. So the communication is the key, but in all of these venues. But I think the nature of communication and perhaps the type of message you have to deliver will be more broadly based and should be reflective, as I said, of different aspirations from different stakeholders, as well as different intended outcomes, which makes it more complex.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Tom. Joe, are there any questions that you've picked up that you'd like to respond to? A lot of chat going on there, a lot of prompts and discussion about sort of values and culture. Do you have any comments? We've got a couple of minutes, about a minute or so before we go to our next video.
No, I would just like to pull in, though, again with Tom and Antoine. Specifically, there was another question, let me find it, about conflicting time and resource pressures of that innovating your value proposition, testing and implementing this with subsequent steps of internationalization, I got it right this time, and integration. I think that's something that's actually pulling everything together that was really mentioned in the walk that was given to us by Tom. So Antoine, can you type? The other thing we've also got is a question about whether alignment is about buy-in. Isn't alignment about buy-in? So again, please, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Joe. What I'd like participants to do, particularly on C there, can you give some examples of using some of the tools taught, let's say, on the business schools or at Open University Business School, whether it's at certificate, diploma, or MBA level? If you've got some examples of some frameworks that are really making a difference to how you formulate and implement strategy, so that'd be good. Right, Janet, I'd like to pass control to you. We'll have the next video, please.
On the basis of some pragmatic strategies, I think there are 4 things, in my experience, across all these different environments that I would characterize as being criteria for success. The first characteristic is what I'd call market-led rigor and ambition. You have to have that. I don't mean that means, as Tom said, a huge analytical resource behind you, but you have to be really clear about the opportunity and make sure that there's also some stretch and ambition in it as well. Right, second key characteristic for me is what I'd call having really, really strong situational awareness. So it's great coming up with the thinking, but if you don't really understand the environment that you're in and you're trying to actually operationalize the strategy, and you're sort of dead in the water, to be honest. I'm going to give you an example of that around what we might call organizational alignment. When we arrived at Cable & Wireless, it was losing £2 million cash a day. The chairman of the business put in place quite a controversial incentive scheme that was similar to private equity, where he directly aligned my pay and some of the other executives with effectively what the shareholders wanted, which is sort this business out and create some shareholder value. Now, I promise you that that sort of scheme, controversial though it was, does drive behaviours in a way that's aligned with shareholders. Clear agenda is make this business cash generative. When your personal wealth depends on it, it tends to force you to take the right decisions, and most importantly, take the right decisions quickly. The third piece for me is about strategies have to be adaptive. I really don't believe that destinations can be set. Direction of travel is really important, and an awareness to look around you to spot new opportunities on the way that are consistent with that direction of travel is actually the most important thing. So the analogy I use, if you're traveling to Brazil, don't worry about the Brazilian coastline, just make sure you leave Liverpool. The last thing, I think, in terms of characteristics of success or successful strategies is where they build very strong, clear alignment between the boardroom and the front line. So I could, for example, go and tell the 10,000 contact center agents in the business that what we want to do is deliver our business plan, because our business plan means we're going to deliver 25% more profit and revenue for capita, and that's good for everyone because we can invest. They are not interested at all, nor should they be. You know, these are people who come to work 9 to 5 a day, want money for the weekend. I'm not being, that's the reality of some of the people we employ. But telling them a story about what we want to be famous for, okay, well, that's maybe something that they can relate to. I actually think that is something that resonates with them. So that alignment piece is incredibly important, and Energist was great at it, and there's some very simple techniques you can do. So I'm sure each of you in your organizations, the executive team, meets weekly. We used a cascade process that after that meeting, everybody then had to take the messages out to their team. So everyone in the organization got it. If you didn't do it as a manager, it's a disciplinary offense, because then you're not managing your business, and you're certainly not leading your teams. So that connective tissue, I think, is incredibly important.
It took us about 5 years to get to 1 million reviews and opinions. And currently, we're growing at about 1 million reviews and opinions every month. We are growing. We are focusing on APAC. We are relatively big in English-speaking markets, but we are focusing nearly all our effort and attention on the right-hand side for obvious reasons. So what we do is we have a philosophy that speed wins. So the things that I would say are key to our success are we are outrageous in terms of what we expect the growth to be. It's all about how ambitious and imaginative we can be, not driven by budgeting as other companies I've worked in. In 2010, TripAdvisor was the first company to take an API, which means you can integrate your site with Facebook. And Facebook doesn't give this opportunity to many people. It meant that we were real friends. We can see into your Facebook regime. We can see what your friends are doing. You can see what your friends are doing. We can then show you reviews from your friends first. So, embracing technology. Now, the founder of the company, it made me laugh. When we first talked to him about mobile, he actually didn't agree it was a good idea, but now has understood it, and we've got these many people interacting on those kind of devices. We have city guides now, so you can download something onto your mobile, so you don't have the roaming charges, which is quite cool. So we are getting to the source. So now it's not be a choice anymore that you're going to download an app from TripAdvisor. There will be one there whether you want it or not. And then there's embracing co-opetition. We decided that we had all this content that people wanted. Why not put it on all these other websites? We encourage everybody who we work with, or everybody and everybody, to use our data, use our brand, use our content. All our partners who are travel partners send out emails on our behalf. So if you have stayed in Ramada, that you will get Kevin got a "How was your stay?" courtesy of TripAdvisor, and they just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. But businesses are beginning to understand they need to embrace user-generated content. These people are claiming that they increase their conversion rate by 30%, which is vast, really significant if you're in the hotel business. Search engine optimization, as I was saying, is the key reason for our success. We wouldn't be in business if it wasn't for it. But basically what happens is, people will put in very general search terms. The first things that will appear are the people who are bidding for it, paying squillions of money to Google. Then Google does its own advertising, and then invariably you should see TripAdvisor. We don't spend any money on it. We just have a shed load of people who work on this. We have, at last count, it was about just over 1,000 engineers, software engineers, who spend their whole life developing programs, figuring out what Google is doing with its search and so on, and making it work on behalf of TripAdvisor. So I was saying I didn't know whether we could be accused of having a strategy. if you could call this a strategy, I would say the things you could take from the TripAdvisor playbook are think enormous, try things and don't worry about being crappy, jump into the start of a trend, get comfortable with your frenemies, and get an expert in to do SEO because it's crucially important.
Okay, so we've got two polls there, two short videos, and I'm going to go straight to the part one, video 3, part one poll, as people's memory, because two videos there, the memory of the video 3, part 1 might soon fade. So Mike Barnard talked about 4 criteria for success. So my question is, I'm sure they're all important, but for you right now, which do you need to most focus on or improve on? A, the need for much more market-led rigor and ambition. B, to actually improve your own situation awareness of what's actually happening and actually listening to those changes so you can take early action. Is it C, having a more adaptive strategy because the environment is changing fast? Or D, having a better alignment between the top management and what we want to achieve from the front line, in particular actually getting more towards stories and less perhaps kind of management theory, because if we believe that stories really motivate our workforce. So let's set the poll running now, which it is, and see what results come from that. I'll then invite some discussion from our panel, and then we'll move on to part 2. So there'll be a short delay between the end of the poll and, as a result, churn through the electronics of the system. And if you've got any other questions, keep feeding them through. So we'll just wait for that to come through. Very interesting that number A, that the TripAdvisor ambition is very, very powerful, isn't it? Right, okay, that's very interesting results here. D seems to come out top, creating a better alignment between the top management and the message that goes to the front line, followed closely by B, and then we have C and then A. Before we go to get a comment and answer D, I'd just like to ask Joe about B, because from your background you have a considerable awareness of this whole concept of situation awareness. Can you offer some comment on that, and have you got some practical advice as how do we actually do that? How do we improve our situation awareness if it's so important?
Yes, completely right, Peter. And situational awareness, to me, that's the one I chose, is absolutely key, because if you don't understand what's happening, if you don't understand the interdependencies, the complexities, it doesn't really matter about whether you're in alignment or not, because there is this lack of understanding contextually. Again, I can speak from a military standpoint, when situational awareness and SA is used all of the time, and especially as my life as a frontline pilot, if you need SA, and the best way to gain SA is to get out there and do it, is to build your capacity by practical application. And you know, it doesn't matter how much time you're sat back in an office. You need to be wherever your context takes you within your organisation, and asking questions and looking and seeing and learning.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, and that also assumes that the culture encourages people to ask questions. So again, culture is very important. I'm going to. I know Antoine can hear us, but he can't speak. But I'd certainly like if Antoine's able to comment on D while he's some thoughts on that. Can I ask Tom, just looking at this poll, what are you surprised by the sort of answers we're getting? Do you think that actually C would have got more votes? What's your thoughts from the results overall?
No, not really, because I think there is clearly a challenge in most organizations that I've observed between the formulation and the implementation of strategy, and I think that this poll reflects that really. The fact that many of our people who are participating this evening clearly, either right now or in the past, have experienced a situation where they perhaps feel frustrated that they are not included in, or they're not really aware of what's going on or what the direction of the company is, or they feel like they're perhaps, they just don't know what it is. They have no sense of what the vision and direction is of the enterprise. So no, this doesn't surprise me, and I think it just highlights that the biggest challenge with strategy today still, and it has been for a long time, is the effective implementation of the strategy. And the implementation of the strategy is through the people, right? It's through the front line, and it's through partners as well, in fact, because the best strategy has to be embedded into the DNA of the organization, into the culture and practices of the people.
Brilliant. That's a really important point. Thank you, Tom. And Antoine has said the best way to bridge the gap is having an open and frequent dialogue. And you know what's surprising, I mean, I think we all recognize that implementation is important, but this theme of alignment seems to come out very strongly over the last three videos we've been seeing. And in Dell, as Antoine is saying, we had monthly town halls, quarterly all hands. I love those mix of metaphors, town halls and all hands, which comes again from the military, management one-to-ones, skip level leader town halls. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe Antoine can explain. So it just shows there's a great richness of language about communications. I'm going to move on, looking at the time, to the next poll. So in the last video, we heard particularly about TripAdvisor, and it may be a model that inspires you, or you may think that's very, very different. So we'd like to run the poll now. Janet, if you could set this up. Learning from TripAdvisor and what Alison Kopus has said in that short 3 or 4 minute clip, what's the most important thing for your organization? And perhaps moving away from the alignment questions, is again having this more ambitious goal? Is it actually actively finding and embracing the concept of frenemies, actually looking at some of our competitors and saying we actually need to be collaborating more actively with them, not until we're forced to, but actually to go out and find them? Is it C, to make much more use of search engine optimization and technology and use the data, because the technology could be a real enabler? Or is it actually about the culture, experimenting, being bold, making faster decisions, and not spending so long doing it? And again, how do you do that in a large organization in particular? So let's set the poll now running. Again, which is the most important thing for you right now of those 4? Right, yes, okay, fantastic. As I've been talking, the results have come out. Wow, it's quite amazing. D comes out, experimenting, being bold, making faster decisions. Now, you could argue that that's perhaps a sort of a cultural thing, but Joe, can you give us an example from your experience of some stories or organizations which have actually been more successful because they've changed their attitude? They've embraced point D there, been experimented, been bold, and maybe taken more of a risk on point D there. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then I'll ask Tom for his views.
Well, I think many of the sort of social media, and if you think about how we didn't tweet, Twitter. If you think about Google, which I know has been mentioned before, I think that there's been a great deal of experimentation and bold and faster decisions. We only had a real taste of what Alison was talking about. I was fascinated by her presentation when we were there. The amount of people that they have focused on making the decisions fast, and she really focused on saying they just get on with stuff, that it's not perfect, it's not 100%, they just get it out the door, because next week it'll be different, and they just keep changing and throwing it out all the time. And that was really refreshing, because I think it can be so easy to become stagnated and focused on one area.
Thank you, Jo. Tom, we heard earlier about Ryanair obviously experimenting and being bold. What's your experience from your work, particularly of larger companies that have perhaps followed, been used to a more stable environment? How do they start experimenting and becoming bold and making these faster decisions? Because it might take some time to actually move towards that way of operating.
Yeah, I would just observe as well that it's interesting that more than half of our participants didn't have an answer. So I hope that we're I hope that we're not throwing out questions there that people perhaps are not fully engaging with, or maybe it actually just reflects the fact that people seem to be a little bit distanced from strategy making, and I think that's a problem, and that's reflective of many organizations. But to answer your question, Peter, I think we have to be careful, because firstly, not every person or not every manager, not every organization is designed to be bold and brave and entrepreneurial necessarily. And to try to instill that into a very large organization is not so easy. And it's certainly not going to happen overnight. So I think first, two things. One is to say that for many larger established organizations that are not naturally inclined towards boldness and entrepreneurship, etc., I would be very careful in how you do it, and that perhaps it would be worth starting it through one initiative or one new product, one new project, maybe a spin-off or some business unit that has a certain team of people that have the ability to do this. Because if you try to just say, okay, now you've got a large organization with various divisions, you say, now we're going to be bold, and now we're going to be creative, now we're going to be entrepreneurial. Well, it's unlikely to happen.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And to some extent, maybe, and it'd be interesting to see if any participants have got any views on this, maybe D is about something personal in your particular area, that we actually want to be a bit more experimental to make faster decisions, even if we are not, as you say, in a company or organization that has got entrepreneurialism at its heart. So it could be just as a personal attitude, which is perhaps different to the wider organization.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, Peter. I just add to that. Yeah, I didn't want to end that sort of on a negative note. I think you're dead right that, in fact, the best way to do this is within your own area, whatever it is, whatever remit you have, whatever control you have or ability to exert any change and influence. Start there. Start there and build from there. And if you do it well, people will notice, and it can begin to spread in that more organic way.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've noticed Antoine's points there. He's done a very good job of responding online. Some very wise words for us to reflect upon. A culture of rewarding risk-taking, lowering the downside of risk-taking, by enabling your staff. I'm looking at the time now, and we've just got a couple of minutes to sort of to wrap up. And it's been quite a canter through, and you've seen some snippets. So this is really a final chance for attendees to pose some questions, but I'm also going to ask Tom first and Jo, if you could just give us an overview from the webinar so far. Do you have any advice or points of reflection you'd like to share with us?
Sure. Do you want me to start, Peter?
Yeah, please, Tom. Yeah.
Well, I think just to make some concluding comments, again, thank you for everybody for giving their time to participate. I think it's important that don't give up. If you feel that strategy is not for you, or that you're not being included in strategy, going back to my previous point, try to bring strategy into whatever it is you do, whatever control you have, whatever remit you have in terms of thinking, attitude, process, and try to combine that with a degree of entrepreneurship. I think the combination of strategy and entrepreneurship in terms of mindset as well as principles and practices are really important in today's world, and that will help you to be innovative, to be fast, to be flexible, to do all of the things we've mentioned already. So in summary, strategy is for everybody, and it is something that needs to be demystified and taken control of and owned really by everybody in an organization, even if not everybody is necessarily shaping it at all times.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Joe, I'd like you to offer a view, and I'll just put up the next slide, and perhaps you could then just remind us about how we continue the dialogue. So, Joe, what's your takeaway? Your one takeaway from this evening you'd like to share?
My takeaway is that I've been building my situational awareness and capacity by managing the Q&A, the questions, the relaying, and
well
then respond to your answers. So yes, practice is what it's all about, and just having a go and being out there. I just want to finish off really with saying that this isn't the end. This is just a taster of what we've had, that you can go and share your perspectives. I'm unable now to post them up at the same time. So go on to the Business Perspectives blog. You can see the website there. Get in touch with the alumni and learn more about what's available. Peter, if you could just show the next slide, please.
Yeah, just a second. Yeah,
click over, and really, what's next? This isn't the end. You know, these are quarterly events about business perspectives. The next one's on leadership, and is all about you, about exploring the ways that you can overcome the challenges of what's been a very difficult marketplace for a few years. And that one's going to be in London on the 25th of April. And again, on the alumni website, you'll find all the information that you need, and really hope to see you there. Peter, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed. That just links nicely with Antoine's concluding comment there about communicating, reward risk-taking, enabling and trusting your staff. So, you know, again, that all boils down to leadership attitudes. Well, like I said, it's just gone past 8 now, so it's my role to now conclude. Now, what I'd like to do is to thank our panelists, Antoine Boatwright, Joe Salter, and Tom Lawton, for participating and responding to the questions. And also, I'd like to thank the attendees themselves. We're learning with this new series of events, and we'll keep fine-tuning for the next one.